Hello, I'm Brooke Peterson, owner of Waterdog Photography, and today we are going to talk about lighting in underwater photography. The title of the presentation is Let There Be Light. There are lots of techniques, but there are really only three sources of light in underwater photography. So we can use artificial light, which is lighting with an artificial source such as strobes or video lights or something like that. We can use ambient light, which is when we use light that's available to us, light from the sun, and balanced light. Balanced light is when we use a combination of artificial light and ambient light to create an image that has light throughout. So before we talk about those different lighting techniques, I'd like to talk a little bit about techniques for using the strobes. Often we get hung up a little bit on where we should place the strobes for underwater photography, and it is something that we need to understand a little bit. So I'd like to talk about that just a little bit. Most of the time when we are photographing or we're swimming around looking for something to photograph, we will have our strobes in this position. So if you think of this as a clock. Say the camera body is a clock face, and the hands on the clock are at 9 and 3 o'clock here. That would be just a normal position for most photography, and it works pretty well for most things. Sometimes, though, we need a scene that is different, so we'll move the strobes into different positions for different things to achieve different techniques. One of them is this one down here on the bottom, and this is for a larger area. If we want to light, like say a whole reef scene that's quite large, we might want to bring the strobes up high above the housing like this, and then have them pointing straight out towards the reef that we're trying to light. Now, a lot of people have differing opinions about the strobe's position as far as if they're facing straight forward, if they're tilted out slightly, if they're tilted in slightly. I leave mine just straight ahead. I think that works just as well and as if they're tilted out. Now, some people say that it reduces backscatter or you might get better lighting. I just keep mine straight. I haven't really had a problem with backscatter. The bigger issue with backscatter is where the strobes are placed in relationship to your dome port. So if you look at this image right here, the strobe head is placed well behind the handle of my housing and behind the lens here. And that is what eliminates backscatter, or at least reduces it. When you have the strobe head too close to the dome port or too close to the lens, sometimes you'll get flare on the sides of your image, and it will light up a harsher light on the particles that are in the water, so you might get more backscatter that way. So one of the most important things, no matter which position you're using, if you're using this position where they're up high above, if they're using this position here, the strobes need to be back behind the housing. Just a little lesson on how the light comes out of your strobe. So the strobe light comes out in the shape of a cone, and that cone can be anywhere from 90 degrees to maybe 120 degrees. A lot of it depends on if you're using a diffuser or not. But a good rule of thumb for using the strobes then is that they are as far apart from each other as your lens is from your subject. So this little area right here where the cone of light intersects, let's say that's where your subject is, and probably should be somewhere in this area right here. The reason for that being that whatever is lit up is going to reflect back into your lens, and that's what causes backscatter. So if you have a lot of particles in the water and you have a subject that's way out here and you're lighting up all that area in front of the subject, you're much more likely to get backscatter in front of your subject. So that's why people say if you tilt the strobe head out slightly, then that cone intersects down here instead. So you can get things a little bit further away. Although I don't think that it makes that big a difference. I think it's more important the relationship between how close your strobes are to each other and how close your lens is to the subject here. So keep that in mind. So let's say that these strobes are placed about 18 inches apart, then you would want your subject to be about 18 inches from your lens. Just a good rule of thumb and something to think about. Also, diffusers are important. I use several different types of diffusers. I use the YSD2 strobes, and they come with these flat diffusers like this, 100 degrees or 110 degrees or 20 degrees or something like that. All that really means is that the light coming out of that cone is softer on the sides, depending on the diffuser that she used. Now I like these diffusers, the flat ones that they come with for macro photography and for getting in real tight on things. But if I'm shooting wide angle photography, I prefer an aftermarket dome diffuser like this. The dome diffusers just give a lot softer light. Not very many strobes come with those. I think the Retra, if you can get a hold of a Retra, they have a dome diffuser built in. But most of them come with something flat like this that just diffuses the light, and it works just fine. You can use these for wide angle photography. I just prefer the dome diffuser because of the softer light that it gives. So I will use diffusers, and then there's one occasion when you don't need a diffuser at all. But if you take the diffusers off, your light is much harsher, and it has a real hard edge. So I prefer to use a diffuser most of the time, but there is one case, and we'll talk about that later. All right, so when we're lighting a large scene, like this is a big reef scene that we're lighting, the strobes need to be in a place that it lights up that entire scene. So if you look towards the back of this image, you can see the light is falling off back in here. I'm quite a ways from this. This is several feet away, and so that's just as far as the light could reach. It could reach back that far. And then also on the sides, you don't want to have any fall off of light on the sides of your image. So the way that you accomplish this is by putting the strobes up high above the housing and then pointing them straight out. And they can be a foot or 2 or 3 feet apart if you want, but the further apart they are, then they're not quite as high. So I do prefer them a little bit higher, at a position like maybe 1 o'clock and 11 o'clock, something like that on a clock face. Maybe 10 and 2 if you're really trying to light up the sides too. But what you don't want is a dark shadow down the middle of your image. So you don't want to point your strobes out at all, because then you'll get a dark shadow in the middle of your image. And also you don't want to have just a portion lit, and you want that light to look natural as well. So the larger that the area that you have, then the higher your strobes should be. And the smaller area that you have, then the closer the strobes are tucked into your housing. A lot of times we are creating a vertical image rather than a horizontal image, and so then you need to adjust your strobe so that the strobe on the bottom is at a lot lower power than the strobe on top. So let's say you're taking a picture and you have your strobes at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and then you turn your housing to take a vertical picture. Now your strobes are at 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock. If you are doing that, then your bottom strobe, the one at 6 o'clock, is going to be too high of a power because it's closer to the reef. So you'll need to turn that strobe down. So if you look at this first image right here, you can see down at the bottom it's a really unnatural lighting. It's very harsh. I had both strobes at the same power, about 3/4 power, and I have weird harsh shadows that make, looks like it's underlit, like the light's coming up from the bottom, and it's just really unnatural looking and harsh. Excuse me, and really not a very good image at all. So it's not really an image that we could use. But the image on the left, once I realized that I had done that, I adjusted my strobe quickly and I turned down the bottom strobe maybe 3/4 of the way down. So the bottom strobe is at about 1/4 power, and the top strobe is still at about 3/4 power. Now I have a very evenly lit image. There's not any weird underlighting. It just makes a much nicer photo, but the strobes are definitely not at the same power. So that's something to pay attention to. Your strobes don't always have to be at the same power. It depends on what type of picture you're trying to take, and especially if it's a vertical. Also, it's important to pay attention to what is important in your image. So if you look at this image, here I did have my strobes at 9 and 3 o'clock, and you can see at the top of this image, it's all shadowed. This is a really big sea fan, and the light just didn't reach all the way to the top. And not only that, but the model isn't lit up very well. He could be just a little bit closer, but you can see his face is quite green, and there's just not enough lighting on his face, and that's quite important because he's my secondary subject. So the expression on his face is important. I should have brought the strobes up a little bit higher and maybe turned one towards his face a little bit, or had him come a little bit closer so that his face was lit up as well. And then just a little tiny side note about modeling. He's doing a great job. He's got his eyes on the subject, my main subject, which is this big fan. He's looking at that, but his face is turned towards me so that the camera can catch the light. And you can see right inside his mask, there is a little bit of light inside of his mask, and that's what you want. You want to be able to light up his eyes, because his mouth can't really tell a happy story because he's breathing, through that regulator. The regulator is covering it up. But you can smile with your eyes, and so that's kind of important that he's able to use his eyes, and that you're able to see his eyes to tell the story. Next picture, this diver is looking directly at the jelly, and her expression looks like one of wonder. You can tell that she's a part of the story, and she's a secondary subject, but that's a really important thing, that she's able to be a part of the image and tell part of the story. And so the light on her face is much, much better. She's lit up just as well as the jelly in front of her, even though the jelly is just huge, and she's probably at least a foot or more behind it. So in this case, the strobe on the left would have had a little bit more power than the strobe on the on the right, just so that she was lit up a little bit better. All right, let's talk just a tiny bit about close focus wide angle shots. So in a close focus wide angle shot, you have a subject that is very, very close to your dome port. And in this case, you want to be able to light that subject well. And close focus wide angle is really effective because the image, the subject, will just pop off the page and look like it's floating, like this eel. It comes far away from its background, even though it's right on its background. So I'm focusing close, the background is blurry, and the thing that's important here is lighting the subject. So this eel is so close to my dome port that you can see right here his nose and the bottom of his chin are actually touching the dome port. So there wasn't any way to get light on his nose here and this big shadow here. If he had been maybe an inch further back, I could have done it. But so if you have an image or a subject like this that is very, very close, you want to have your strobes very, very close to your housing. Now, if you have a great big dome port, that makes it really difficult because with a big dome port, it's going to shadow a little bit further. So the key to getting great close focus wide angle is to have as small a dome port as you can, a compact dome port if possible, and to have your strobes as close to your camera housing as possible. So smaller cameras, they do a little bit better job of close focus wide angle. If you have a large camera, you can actually take the handles off your camera so that you can get your strobes in a little bit closer if you want. And that way you'll still be able to keep the strobes behind the lens, but they're close enough to the subject to light up the entire subject without leaving a shadow in between. So that's just a little tip on lighting close focus wide angle things. And then the background, it doesn't matter. If you have a nice big blue background behind, that's fine. You're using the sun to you're metering for the sun back there, or for the blue water back behind it. In this case, it was a reef, and so I didn't need very much light on the reef, and he was probably I don't know, 10 or 12 inches off the reef, so the light didn't quite reach that far. Okay, this is one time when you might want to use the strobes to isolate your subject from a background. So this is one of those feather dusters. They are maybe 2 inches off of a reef. And if you look in the picture here on the left, this feather duster is lit up quite well. The whole background is lit up quite well. And it's not a bad image. I'm not saying that there's anything bad about it, but I wanted to isolate that from the reef without using any other tools, just my strobes. And so on the picture on the right, what I did was take the diffusers off of my strobes so that there was a hard line of light. And then I pulled the strobes out from my camera housing as far to the right and left as they could go. 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, all the way out. And then I turned the strobes back towards the housing so that the cone of light, the outside cone of light, just barely hit this part of the reef without hitting this behind here. So now I do have a really harsh line of light. Most of the light is being absorbed by my camera housing and myself because I have it turned back towards me and towards my housing. But the outside line of light is crossing just on the front of this feather duster here, and that lights up the feather duster without casting any light behind it. And you can do that with lots of different subjects, and you can do it with both wide angle and macro shots, and it's a really effective way to light up something without lighting up its background, and it isolates the subject. Okay, so now let's talk about those other techniques, the artificial light and the ambient light, and then the blending of the light. So artificial light, we have lots of different things that we can use to light things up artificially. We use strobes, we use snoots, which are attached to strobes. It's a way of taking your wide cone of light and making it a small spotlight instead. You can use a torch or a flashlight, video light, remote light, meaning light that is not on your camera, but maybe you have a flash that will sync with your strobe so that it flashes as well, or video light, be it back in a different spot, remote lighting, and a combination of all of these things. So I'd like to talk about some of these things so that you have a better understanding of how we use artificial light. So when we use artificial light, often we are lighting something that we don't want any ambient light coming in, so it will be something with a black background. And there's a couple of different techniques for creating a black background, but one of them is just to have nothing behind your subject except for water. So the way that photography works is that light bounces off of the subject and comes back into your lens and creates an image on the sensor. And so this fish and this little whipped coral that it's on, the light is bouncing off of that and coming back into the lens and creates that image. But the rest of the light just keeps going because there's nothing behind it to bounce back on. And so that's what creates a black background. You have to have your settings dialed in pretty tight. So you have to have an aperture of maybe, if you have a small camera, f11 or f16, about as high as it'll go. If you have a DSLR, f18 or f22, something like that, so that you have that black background. You also have to have your shutter speed as fast as you can make it, so that it will sync with your strobe. Sorry, as fast as you can get it to sync with your strobe. So that's usually 1/200 or 250. Some cameras 1/320, and then your ISO is low, like 100 or maybe 200 at the most. That's how you can create a black background. You're just not letting any ambient light into the camera sensor, so the only ambient or the only light is coming from your strobes. This is just another example of that, a little Cassiopeia that was up in the water column, and the light from my strobes is hitting the Cassiopeia, but there was nothing else for the light to bounce off of. This was in the afternoon or late in the afternoon, and the water was blue, and so the way that it became black was just by dialing down my my settings on my camera so that not any ambient light came in and all the light came from my strobes. All right, so let's talk about using a snoot. So a snoot is, there's a couple of different types, but a snoot is a device generally that goes on to the end of your strobe, and it grades the light down into a spotlight. There's a couple of different kinds. There's a fiber optic snoot, and that's using fiber optic cables, and I like that kind because you can articulate the light wherever you want. It doesn't have to come from directly from above or from the front or whatever. You can move that that around a little bit so the light can come from the back or from the side or something like that. Also, the retro light shaping device is another one, and that is the light just coming straight down from the strobe and being graded down, and it comes through a little lens, so it makes the light a little bit more powerful, or it's like putting the sun through a magnifying glass. It makes the light a little bit brighter. It also has a little bit harsher edge, and so sometimes you need to pull that away from your subject a little bit to soften up the edge some. And there's other snoots out there, but a lot of them are homemade snoots, and they work just fine. It's just a way of taking the light from your strobe and grading it down until it's a small, coming out of a small hole. And so the effect of that is a spotlight. You can see how it spotlights this. The light is coming from directly above, and you can see there's not very much fall off of light around the edge. It's got kind of a harsh edge around here. Also, the shadows underneath this flamboyant cuttlefish are quite dark and dramatic. So it does make a really dramatic shot. You could use a little bit of fill flash if you didn't want something quite so dramatic, but it's a great way to isolate your subject from the background. So all of this sand here, it was a huge sandy bottom. It would have been all sand back in here too. But with the snoot, all of that disappears, and really you just see the subject. So a snoot can be a really great tool. To snoot or not to snoot. I think it depends on the subject and the effect that you're trying to get. But there are definitely some subjects which really have to have a snoot in order to look good, and this is one of them. This is this Molibe Colamani nudibranch, and if you look at the picture here on the left, it looks like a big ball of string. It's really hard to tell what it even is. It blends so much into its background that if you'd never seen one before, you wouldn't even know what you're looking at. And so that picture was taken with 2 strobes, and there's nothing wrong with the way it's lit. It's just that the animal itself blends too much into its background. And there's a lot of animals out there that are camouflage, and so they need a snoot in order to isolate them from the other things in their environment. So this one on the right, this is taken with a snoot, and it's a much better shot because you don't have anything in the background that's distracting from the animal itself. And this is a difficult animal to photograph because all of these little fibers that you see in here are its muscle structure. These little, the round circles here are its stomach, and then this is its serrata up here, and these are its rhinophores over here. This is its mouth down here. Now the rest of the animal, except for its muscle fibers, is clear, and so you're able to see right through it, and that's what makes it so cryptic. It's very, very difficult to tell what type of an animal this is. So, but with a snoot, now you get a very nice outline of it, and you can see much better what it is, and a much more dramatic and interesting shot. This is another snooted pair of nudibranchs that are mating, and in this case, they were sitting up on a little knoll, or this is a little hill here, but actually this kept going off to the sides, and there was nothing but water back up in here, so that wasn't difficult to get that dark. But I really wanted them to look like they were sitting up on a rock, and so I used a snoot, and the only light fell just on here, and made quite a dramatic picture. So you can use it to create dramatic effect, to really isolate a subject, to give yourself a black background. There's lots of advantages to using a snoot. Okay, so this is something that I wanted to mention. These are cuttlefish eggs with little embryos inside, and when I first took the picture, all of these cuttlefish eggs came out opaque, like the outside edges of this. You couldn't see through them at all. And I had used strobes, and the strobe light just bounced right back off of them and made white circles, and so you couldn't see what they were. And I really wanted to show the embryo inside. So I moved the light to behind the cuttlefish eggs in the back, coming through the eggs so that you could see what was inside. I ended up using a snoot in the end so that I could, because these are quite small, maybe about the size of a dime or a half penny, something like that. They're real small, and I wanted to be able to see through them, but my strobe light was just, it was just too big, and it was causing a lot of flare on the sides. So I did put a snoot on, and then I shot the snoot from back in this corner, coming across the image like this to light what was inside. So sometimes it's necessary to look at what you're photographing and decide how best can this be lit. Sometimes it just takes some trial and error to find that out. But this is one way of lighting through something so that you can see what's inside. This is another example of lighting through. This one's a little bit more difficult. So I don't know if you've ever seen these little tunicates, but they're maybe 1.5 or 2 inches tall, and you see them on rocks and things. And sometimes if you look down inside the tunicate, you'll see an amphipod down in the bottom of the tunicate. But it's down in the bottom, and that's about 2 inches away. And amphipods are very, very small. So if you want to take a picture of the amphipod, you have to use a diopter in order to get it magnified enough. And the working distance with a diopter is only about 1.5 to 2 inches, which is all the space that you have from the top of the tunicate down to the bottom where the amphipod is. And so what I'm getting at is that this top part of the amphipod was up tight against the lens in order for my lens to be able to focus down deep enough to get to this amphipod in the bottom. So what that did was make no possible way for light to come in through the top and get down into that amphipod. The light had to actually come through the amphipod. So I had my strobes on either side, over on the left and over on the right, and just let the light go through and light the amphipod. So in the end, I was able to get the image and I was able to get it in focus, but everything was blue inside because the light was coming through a blue tunicate to light a brown amphipod, and so everything was very blue. And not only that, but everything here on this side was blown out. It was too much light. It was very, very bright. So it did require some post-processing. I had to white balance for the amphipod inside to get that color right, and then I had to darken down the left-hand side, and actually maybe a little of the right too, in order to make an image that was viable. So I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that sometimes post-processing is needed, even with strobes, but that there's still a possibility. It's not a ruined shot. It's just something you wouldn't be able to use in a contest, but it'd be a great shot to show off to your friends and post on social media and that kind of thing. Okay, and then also we often use lights to backlight something. So when you're backlighting an image, that's when you have the light coming directly back towards your camera lens, and you're just kind of using a silhouette of something. So this light is back behind this, forget what this thing's called. It's a fire urchin, back behind this fire urchin. And the light, you have to have it kind of hiding far enough that it doesn't come directly into the lens. It blocks most of the light, but the light is going through the spines of this fire urchin in order to make an interesting image. And sometimes you'll use this for other techniques as well, but backlighting can be a really effective way to use your strobes. Sometimes you need to use a combination of different things. This is a shot that I had to plan, and it took me several days to get it. So when I first saw this snake eel, I thought, oh, I'd really like to shoot that snake eel in silhouette, but I didn't have the right tools with me at the time. So I went back a few days later and found it again. And this time I had with me a torch, and I also had a snoot. And so I used the snoot with the very tiniest hole opening that I had just to light the eye of this snake eel. And then I used the torch behind it, and I had it placed maybe a foot or maybe even more than that, maybe almost 2 feet back behind the eel, in order to get this nice outline around its mouth and head. But I still felt like it needed the eye lit up as well in order to tell that it was a snake eel. Otherwise you wouldn't really know that it was an animal at all. And then there's always not always, but there's often a little shrimp that is around the snake eel, that they have a symbiotic relationship. And so I had to wait for the shrimp to get in the right position. But the light from the backlighting is coming through the shrimp, and that's what's lighting him. The only light I have coming from the front is from a snoot. So I'm using a snoot in the front and a torch in the back. One thing to note, the light from the torch is not nearly as bright as the light from your strobe. And so you have to adjust your settings quite a bit. And it can be a little bit of a difficult balance, because if you open up your settings enough that you can get a nice bright light from a backlit using a torch or a video light, then you might end up letting in enough ambient light back in here to light up your background. And I really wanted a black background back there. So it was a little bit of a balancing act to get it dark enough that there was the background was dark, and bright enough that there was a nice bright line around the silhouette of the snake eel, and lighting this guy up enough, the shrimp. So again, it's a case of trial and error, but it's a way of using multiple lights to make an interesting image and a much more creative image than just shooting it with a strobe. Okay, and then torch and video light. So this is kind of the same concept. I had a torch back here behind this big tunicate, and this little frogfish was actually tucked in beside here. But the important thing on a frogfish, or at least on a hairy frogfish like this, is all this hair. I really wanted to show off this hair. But when I used just my strobes, for one thing, I got a big shadow on this side because the strobe couldn't go past the tunicate, so it cast a shadow on his face. And if I used just the strobe on this side, all I got was this. I still got the frogfish and really interesting striation in his face and that kind of thing, but the hair didn't show up very much, and I really wanted to show off that hair. So I used a torch, or maybe I had a video light. No, I had the focus light off of my camera, and I placed that back behind this tunicate, and it was just enough light to get the top of his hair here and light that up, and it really made a much better image because now I was able to show the important part of the fish and still tell a little bit of a story with that. So again, another combination of different lighting. Oh, and I didn't use the right hand strobe at all, only a little bit of strobe on the left to fill in, and then everything else was from the focus light behind. Okay, let's talk a little bit about off-camera lighting. You often use off-camera lighting in order to create depth in an image. So in this case, this is a really huge room inside the Fujikawa Maru. This is a ship that's sunk in Truck Lagoon, and it's so vast that the strobes wouldn't reach very far. And also I'm using quite a bit of ambient light because I really wanted the sunbeams coming down from the ceiling to show. But you know, there's maybe some things back in here I could have used a strobe on, but I thought it would be interesting to light up this ladder here, but I didn't have enough power from where I was using my strobes to light that. So I used a remote strobe there. So I had a third strobe, and I placed it so that it lit up the ladder, and then there was a trigger on that strobe that when my strobes from my camera went off, it triggered that strobe to light up the stairs. And that can be really effective if you wanted to light say I could put the light right back here behind this block and emphasize that, or maybe if there's something back behind that railing, I could have put the strobe back in there and emphasize that. It gives more emphasis and more depth to an image that has a lot of dark space, or maybe you just want to show off something else in the image that's too far away for your strobes. This is another image that I'm using a remote strobe. So this is down inside the hold of the thistlegorm, and it's completely dark in there. There's no ambient light coming in at all. And so if I were to take this picture of this truck with just my strobes, all I would get is a flat image of a truck. You wouldn't see any of this light. This would be a dark square, just like this one is over here. And so what I did was, there's two trucks there. There's one behind the other. And in the bed of this truck, or in the cab of this truck, I put another strobe, and it's a remote strobe, and so the light from here is what's lighting up the tire in the back of it and that other cab, and it allows you to see a little bit more depth. It's a much more interesting image because there's more depth to the image than just the flat side of a truck. Also, if you are shooting inside of a cave, or in this case inside of a chamber where it's completely dark behind it and you're trying to shoot a model, if that model has on a black wetsuit, you're going to end up with a bobbing head. All you'll see is the face lit up, and everything else will be black because there's nothing behind the model that you can light up if it's in a dark space. And so here I have a remote strobe back behind her, and it's lighting up a little bit of her hair and her silhouette and showing a little bit of the inside of the chamber a little bit better. Makes a much more interesting image. Again, it gives it more depth. So it's a great way to isolate or emphasize your subject. This is used often in cave diving as well, to show the depth of the cave and the things that they're swimming through, and still show a whole diver and not just a diver's face. Also, you can use a remote strobe just for creative effect. So this is also inside the hold of the thistlegorm, and there's actually some ambient light that you can get on if you shoot this from another angle, but here, behind here, is just another hold, and it's black back in there. And so if you, here I place the remote strobe back behind the bike just to give the bike some emphasis and make it a little bit more interesting of a picture. So you can use it for creative effect as well. Okay, I want to talk just a little bit about special lighting effects. Let me talk about how the world is divided on how to be creative. So if you look at the eastern side of the world, their train of thought or their philosophy behind creative photography is creativeness first and subject is secondary. So they have all kinds of neat tools that they're coming out with that are made for creative effects. In the western part of the world, our train of thought or our philosophy is that the subject comes first and then creativity. So it's kind of an interesting blend, and with social media and all of the groups that we have now that we can look at, we're starting to see a lot more interesting effects come of special lighting. So one of the things I'm going to talk about first is this device right here. This is it's called a mini gear Snoot torch. So it's a flashlight that is powerful enough to be a torch. It has this small little tip that you can put on the end that will give you a tiny, tiny pinpoint of light on something. It also comes with, or you can buy separately, this, it's like several lenses. There's a lens in each of those, and it rotates around. And you can screw it onto the end of the flashlight, and then you can put colored discs in each of these spaces. So you can put in a purple one, a blue one, a yellow, red, green, whatever you want inside, so that your light from this torch is colored. And so let's talk about this image just a little bit. This fish, I actually used two different snoots to light this. I used the mini gear torch snoot with a red filter. So everything you see in the background is red. And I had it set up on a tripod so that I could see that light constantly around the fish, and everything was red. And then I used a retro light shaping device snoot in order to light just the fish, because I wanted to get his natural color back into the image. I didn't want it to be red. You can see there's a little bit of red around his eyes and a little bit of blush red down here. That's all left from the mini gear torch. And that's okay, but it just makes an interesting image. So right now, if you're looking at these types of images, we're seeing all kinds of interesting colors coming out in macro photography, and that's one of the tools they're using to do that, along with other kinds of backgrounds and things that they're using, but that's one of the big ones right now. Another thing that is making a resurgence is this lighting technique right here. And this has been around for a lot of years. Like back in the 1970s, it was kind of a popular thing to use for wedding photography, and it was called the Ring of Fire. And you often saw it like it would give a little bit of a halo effect around a couple in wedding photography, or concerts or other things. It was just kind of an interesting thing. And what the photographer did was he took a copper pipe and held the copper pipe in front of the lens, and when the light hit the copper pipe, it swirled around inside the pipe and framed whatever the subject was going to be. So I've seen it recently in underwater photography, and in fact there's a company right now called Saga that is making these tubes, and I think it's called the Magic Tube. I don't know if it's on the market yet, but I've seen it at DEMA. I think they're available now, if not soon. So all I've done, I've made my own tools to do this. And all this is a pipe. It's a chrome pipe that you can get at Home Depot for a couple of bucks. And I attached it to a metal lens cap that I had drilled to fit the copper or the chrome tube. And then this is this lens cap. It's a metal lens cap with a 67mm thread on it, so it will thread right onto the end of my housing, and I can take it on or off when I want to underwater. And when you go to shoot through that, so I had light coming off of this seahorse, and the light reflected off of the seahorse and went around the tube like that to give that framed effect. And it's kind of a neat effect. People wonder how it's done. It's not rocket science, but it's kind of an interesting effect. It takes a little bit of effort to shoot like that. But anyway, it's just another creative thing that you can do with light. Okay, let's move on to ambient light. So ambient light is when you're just using the sun. or the light that's available to you, which is usually from the sun. I don't think we get enough moonlight to take much ambient light shots, so light from the sun. You have to be in quite shallow water because, as you know, as a diver, once you hit about 15 feet, you've lost your reds, and then you lose more colors as you go down from there. So this is only about 4 feet deep, maybe less than that, and you're able to use ambient light in shallow conditions like this without having to use any kind of strobe or anything else at all. I'll also talk a little bit about using filters if you still want to use ambient light but you're a little bit deeper. But first, let's talk about the effect that you have when you're using ambient light, or even if you're using strobes. But usually you use ambient light when you have something that is so large you can't really light it with your strobes, and so you have to use the light that's available to you. Now, if you shoot towards the sun, you're going to get an image that has a lot more shadows in it, and it's a lot more dramatic type of an image. If you shoot with the sun at your back, then you'll get a lot more detail and a lot more color. So that's this shot right here. You'll get more detail in there, and there is more color in this shot as well, but it's not because I'm using strobes, it's because I was using a filter, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But definitely the detail. You can see the detail in the ship a lot better, and not as much drama from the shadows. All right, so let's talk about using filters. If you're a video shooter, you've probably used filters before, but still shooters, we don't use them quite as often because we have to commit. Once you put that filter on, you can't take it off during the dive. It goes on your lens. It's a color red or an orange piece of colored lens that either screws on the front of your lens or goes back behind the lens, then you put it on your camera, and it's designed to bring some of those reds and yellows back that you lose as you are going deeper. So if you look at this picture on the left, this is taken with just plain ambient light. There's no filter on my camera, and after the image was done in post-processing, I white balanced the picture so that I get some color back here in the ship. But often what happens with that is you lose the blue water up here. In fact, it gets really washed out at the top, or it might just turn an ugly gray. Sometimes it turns a little bit purple, and it ruins the water in order to get the ship color back. And it used to be acceptable, but we've come a long way in the last 20 years or so with digital photography, and that's not really an acceptable image anymore because you can get much more color. So in this image, I'm using a filter. And you can look at this and see that there is color all the way through the image. It goes all the way to the back here. The blue water is blue all the way to the back. There's no fall off. Here you have a little bit more color and stuff here, but then there's fall off as it goes towards the back, especially back in here. There's no clarity anymore. So the difference of using a filter is that you retain the color all the way through the image. And that's a really important thing and makes a really dramatic and beautiful image. Another example of using a filter and available light. And by the way, you can use a filter somewhere between 30 and 60 feet and get great results with it. Any deeper than that, and you just don't have enough color left in the water to restore any color. What the filter does is restore any color that's left, but it won't put color where there isn't any in the first place. So you still have to stay in fairly shallow water. But here in this one, this is about 15 or 20 feet deep. This is the deck of the kittiwake. It's the wheelhouse of the kittiwake. And you can see all the color that is restored from this. I'm using just ambient light, and you can see the blue floor that used to be painted bright blue. And the water behind is nice and blue all the way through. There's no fall off of color in the water. It makes a really nice image. So you can buy those filters. They're called magic filters, and I'm sure you can find them just about any place. If not, go to magicfilters.com and you'll find them there. But it has a really nice effect, and there is a little bit of a learning curve with it, but there's a very nice effect at the end. Okay, so let's talk about balancing artificial light and ambient light, because really if we're shooting wide-angle photography, that's what we're doing most of the time. We're trying to get a nice balance of the two to make a really beautiful image. So this is a very, very large reef. You can see all the different types of coral here, and the idea that I was trying to get here is that this is lit by the sun, or that you can't tell that I have strobes and that there's also sunlight. So really, if you look at it closely, you can tell that there's some green, there's some fall off of light back in here in the back, but it's far enough back that it's not as noticeable. And if you look at the front here, this is well lit all the way across. So this is one of those times when I'm using the strobes up high and they're spread apart, maybe 2 feet apart here, and turned up all the way so that I can get this entire reef lit. And then I have metered my camera for the blue water. So I wanted the water to look about this color. The sun is directly overhead. Even though it looks like it's up in this corner a little bit, it's directly overhead, so not much is coming from any direction. And you would look at this picture and think that it looks like it was lit just as natural as any picture you would take on land. Really, when we take pictures on land, we don't use very much artificial light. We mostly use the sun, and so that's what our eyes are used to seeing. So when we have something underwater that has that nice blended look, we're seeing something that looks more natural to our eyes and usually much more pleasing to our eyes. Sometimes to blend the light, we have to use another technique. So here, this is using the sun. Let me talk just a little bit about using the sun and trying to get these nice beams in the water. It's not an easy thing to do because the sun is so bright that makes our subject down here very, very dark if we have to meter our camera so that we can shut it down enough to get these beams of light. So when you do this is when the sun is low in the sky, such as in the morning or late in the afternoon, and in very shallow water, because you'll get much more defined beams in shallow water. The deeper you get, the more diffuse the beams get. So I'm probably only about 10 feet deep in this water, maybe even less than that. And it was late in the afternoon, and so these nice sunbeams were coming down through the water, and nice lighting, and I really wanted to capture that. So I metered for the sun, right? So that these beams would show up the most. And you can see that these beams aren't lighting anything. If you look over here where they're landing, they're not lighting that at all. It's much too dark. So all of the light that is on this is coming from my strobes. And it's a little bit of a trick because you want to be careful you don't get too harsh to shadows. And you want it to look like it's being actually lit by the sun. So this is a blended light. It looks like the light is coming down and lighting this, but actually it's the strobe that is lighting this, and then I'm metering for all of this. So it's a combination of the two, and it's a nicely blended image, and that's kind of the goal that you want to have. You want to trick the viewer into thinking that the sun is doing all the work here. But if you look here on the side, you can see that definitely the strobes were lighting it because the sun's not doing anything as far as light under this amount of water. Here's another image. This is a close focus wide angle image, and I'm using the strobe only to light this soft coral here and the piling that it's on. You can see there's another soft coral over here that's not getting lit at all. I had both of my strobes on this. And but I'm still using the rays of the sun. So this again is in the late afternoon. There's all these rays coming down here that add a lot of depth to the image. And also I'm using this light up here through Snell's window to create the illusion that it's all the lighting is coming from one source. So you kind of have to look at it to tell that, oh yeah, there is some strobe here on this, that's what's lighting this up. But if anybody who wasn't an underwater photographer looked at this image, that wouldn't be the first thing they would think. They wouldn't think, oh, you used a strobe underwater and you have this other light. Instead, you want it to be blended enough that it looks like it's all coming from the same source. Also, a little bit about adding depth to your image. If you are in a place that's dark, like if you see a really cool cavern or a cave, or you're in a shipwreck or something like that, you'll always get a better image if you go inside and shoot out so that the blue water is in the background. That's what gives the interest to the image. If you shoot into the cave, you're going to end up with just a picture of a hole in the rock, and it's not going to look very good. But here, this is just a little cavern, and I went inside and shot out as a diver was swimming by through all the kelp, and it made a much more interesting image than just taking a picture of a cave. Also here in this ship, this is a very interesting image because of all the depth. There's a room here, there's a room here, there's a room up above, and a lot to look at, and then having that water in the background gives you the idea that there's a lot to see in there. So it's important to think about how you're using the light in a dark space, and you always want to try to have something blue in the background to add a lot of interest and depth. Also, if you're inside of a cavern, or if there's a large crack in the rock and you want to show that, you need the blue water in the background. In this image here, there was enough ambient light to light up a little bit of the bottom of the cave, but really I needed a diver in order to add a little bit more depth to the image, because this hill back here in the background, it just wasn't quite enough to show the depth that I wanted. So having a diver there gives a little bit of perspective. And then if the diver has a light, that makes it even more interesting. Sometimes you can have them shine the light on something that they're looking at, or if they just have a light in the background, it adds a little bit of depth and perspective to your image. Also, if you look at the image on the right, so this is a close focus wide angle image, and I'm looking out through a large crack in the rock, and this big elephant ear is all being lit by my strobe, and then I have the blended light back here, the light from the sun, and because this diver is far enough away from the camera, he's not lit up at all. He's all in silhouette, but his light gives a little bit of perspective, and it draws your eye and some attention to that. So it's just another way of using some blended light with close focus wide angle. Let me talk just a little bit about silhouettes. Silhouettes are when you have light behind your subject that definitely comes from the sun or something else, and you can use like a off-camera lighting, but generally from the sun, and you're not using any strobe to light up the front part of the subject. So in this case, I have these snorkelers who are just getting down into the water, and the sunset is lighting them. And I do have strobe here, but all of the strobe is underwater because this is a split shot. The strobe is all down here, so there's no strobe falling on their faces. And you can do that with lots of close focus wide angle shots if you've got a diver in the background, and you can keep them in silhouette. They just need to be far enough away that no strobe light hits their body or their face. A little bit about lighting split shots. When you light a split shot, all of your strobe light is going to be under the water because that's what's going to be darkest. But your camera is going to be set for whatever settings you need to get this upper part in focus and properly lit. So you have to use a high aperture so that you have things in focus that are both close and far away. Also, this is close, so all of this needs to be in focus, but you want this mostly in focus as well. So you have to use a high aperture for that. And what that does is it shuts down the light that's coming into your camera. So you might have to use a slower shutter speed than you would normally use. But definitely you have to use strobes to light up what's under the water. So you're going to keep your strobes underwater, and you're going to meter your camera for the light above the water, and then you're going to use a high aperture so that you can get everything in focus, and then you just hope for the best. Okay, I want to talk just a little bit more about split shots. Some of the nicest split shots are not when the image is divided half underwater and half above water, but when the image is divided more into thirds. So if you look at this image, you can see the water line is about a third of the way down, and you can see all the coral underneath here. And then this middle section right here is a refraction of the light shining off of the bottom of the water and showing, again, a repeat of what you're seeing down here. So if you see this little purple coral, this is it up here. It's being refracted, and you're seeing its reflection up on the water there. And the same with this coral and this coral. So that makes a more interesting image. And then the top part of the image, the top third, is something that's interesting above water too. Oh, and one other thing about a split shot, you have to have something interesting above water and something interesting below water. If you only have one of the two, then your image isn't interesting at all. So you need to look for something like a sunset or a mountain range or paddle boat on the water or something, an animal under the water with a nice sunset is nice, but you also have to have something under the water. So and generally when you're taking split shots, if you want a reef in it, the reef has to be shallow, within a couple of feet, no more than maybe 2 or 3 feet at the most, because otherwise it's just not close enough to the surface to, when you're using a wide angle lens, to get that. And you use a wide angle fisheye lens for a split shot. So just a couple little pointers about that. Again, the light is on the bottom, and you want the light underneath to blend with the light on top so that you can't really tell that you're using a separate lighting source for what's underwater. Okay, that concludes the presentation I have. I do lead photo trips. You can get details at waterdogphotography.com. I have a trip coming up to Raja Ampat aboard the wonderful Seven Seas liveaboard. It's January 4th to the 16th, 2021. And I also have a macro workshop next year in Anilao, Philippines. It's at Crystal Blue Resort, and it's March 10th to the 20th, 2020. And you're invited to look at both of those and see if there's something that interests you. You can get all of the details at waterdogphotography.com.